Well, Nancy, are you going to be with it or without it, sweetheart?
Oh, I better turn myself on.
Turn yourself on.
All right. I'm getting here. And I didn't light a candle, so you don't have to look at me.
Nancy
today.
Owen Nelson. You know Nancy, she's a member of our congregation. She is a noted author. And today her talk is The Rock That Is Higher Than I. So I'm going to turn this off. Move that down so you got your mic on.
Yeah, forget that. I'm used to.
There you go.
May the universe bless Eli Milliman and his family for being here and helping me. Whit, who with me is having a heart attack or a stroke or something because we can't get the darn program. If we don't get it up, I'll just say that we're missing some really fun pictures, and maybe he's going to keep working if that won't distract you too much. But it may be technology just saying, so even the candle might not help. Thanks to you for welcoming me, and especially about a topic that is very close to my heart. I do have copies of this memoir at the back if anyone's interested. I have a little discount price. I didn't write it down, but you can ask me for members of this church. And so I will say that I also have earrings on that match the cover because this was my first published creative book well over a decade ago. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the process of the book with some readings from it and some theology. If I see you nodding off, I will either do a dance or cut material. Okay. So
I can hardly hear you.
Oh,
Sorry.
really?
I think that's as loud as we can get it without.
It's kind of bumpy.
Try it now.
Hello, hello, hello.
Better?
A little better.
Better?
Better, better. Oh, I want to also say, I can't see everybody, but my dear, incredibly dear, close friend Donna Steele is here. Thank you for coming. You're awesome to be there. Thank you. So, sometime in about 1915, a 10-year-old girl stood before a grave in Bethel Cemetery near New Hope, Alabama. She studied her mother's gravestone, listening to the cicada calls, to the breeze rustle in the trees above her, while two women stopped to visit a nearby grave. Just within her earshot, she heard one of them say, "That's Nanny B's grave. It's too bad she died and the baby lived." My mother, Nanny B. Chandler Nelson, never forgot that moment, nor did she forget that she had a mother she never met. During her entire life at home with her father, stepfather, and half-siblings, no one spoke of the woman who birthed her, then died an hour later. It was as if she never existed. But my mother felt her absence for an entire life, suffered sadness and guilt until she herself died in October 2001 at 96. My mother had received a painted portrait of her mother for Christmas decades ago, taken from a group photo of Nanny B and her sisters, Minerva, Mary, and Sarah. And I would have had that. Oh my gosh, thank you. It's up. Okay, so this, if you can see, obviously 3 generations of it, going from me to my mother to my grandmother, that's the photo I'm referring to right there. Thank you, Whit. The universe is blessing you. Thank you. Okay, at any rate, this is all she had of her mother and all that I had as well. It was around 2011 when I became curious about my grandmother. Who was she really? What was her family like? Where did she live? In November of 2011, the year before my husband and I found the First UU Church of Detroit, I joined Ancestry.com to begin researching my lineage of my mysterious grandmother. I tapped into my older sister Betty, who had stories about the various people I placed on our tree. Grandpa Russell, his wife Delilah, Jane, their 4 daughters, Mary's daughter, and Aunt Pearl. I had met Aunt Pearl many years before, in the 60s, and as a child, was never really interested in my relationship. Who cares at 16 or 15 with remote relatives? I'm not listening. What are you saying to me, Mom? You know. So it all went from one ear and out the other. But at this point, I was really wanting to know every, DNA particle of sand, everything that I could find out. So I was on a quest now, and I would travel from Michigan to Alabama, find my grandmother's grave, and visit her for the first time. That is, if I could find it. Contacted the Alabama State Records Department. I found that there were no official records of her existence except her marriage certificate to my grandfather, R.E. Chandler. Nothing to mark her life or death. No obituary, no burial information, no death certificate. Is this feedback, brothers? Is it okay? Okay. After hours on Ancestry without luck, I finally put her name into a database of obscure burial information. There it was. Nanny B. Chandler, wife of R.E. Chandler. Her name was misspelled, and I was sure that this was her gravesite at the Bethel Cemetery near Bethel Primitive Baptist Church. I called a genealogist from the closest town, New Hope, Priscilla Scott. She agreed to visit the grave and send me photos, and in one day, I was looking at the stone on my computer screen. This is where my mother stood almost 100 years ago. Let's talk a minute about me and fundamental religion. Among the family stories, I heard my mother being raised in the Primitive Baptist Church, or as Mom called it, old-timey or hard shell. Those stories always made me cringe involuntarily. One in particular stayed with me. My mother and her sister Norma, where they were children, they were in a revival. And though just young children, they decided to go to the altar to be saved. When their father saw them, he turned them right around and went out. He told them, as he walked them back down the aisle, "You may go to hell, but you're going to bed first." At the time, I didn't think it was funny, but later I would. Because I was young, great, guilt and all this stuff. For most of my life, when my mother told this story, I was impressed most by the ghastly notion of a hell of burning fire, of a notion I had heard elsewhere. One of my best friend's fathers was a Baptist minister, and every time I saw him, he would say, "What is the state of your soul, Nancy?" So that means literally cringe. I had heard preachers in the local tabernacle rail about charged up crowds of sinners who walked down the aisle to be saved. Even in the Methodist church, to which my family belonged, a woman chastised me after service because I smiled at a friend from the choir loft. How dare I smile in church? I'd had enough in my lifetime of the hard shell approach to religion. Then came my obsession to find my grandmother. How could I understand her if I did not try to understand her faith, the faith of her parents, the faith in which my mother was raised? I resolved to research it. So you're going to get some research here, but it's going to be scattered with some stories, so don't worry too much. I made contact via the internet with a Presbyterian minister, Sherman Isabel. I don't think he's related to Jason. I never asked him, but who's done extensive work in the Primitive Baptists in the South. He opened the door for a new way of thinking about them. Our correspondence involved figuring out if my parents, R.E. and Nanny B. Chandler, had attended his Bethel church in Marshall County. It just took a few emails to realize that they had attended a different one in Madison County, 40 miles distant. According to Sherman, though, quote, the roads would have been difficult for them to travel. This was an era, of course, before the automobile. We're talking literally 1904. However, Sherman said I was welcome to attend his family reunion in Asbury on June 11th for exposure to two typical Primitive Baptist cemeteries. June 9th gave me a good plan, a goal for planning my trip. I structured my journey around it and included a visit with friends in Kentucky, arrival in Hartselle, my then hometown, to visit my parents' graves, then the Asbury Bethel reunion, and then a visit to the grave in New Hope, Bethel Church, which was 20 minutes or so from Huntsville. My journey was taking shape. I'm getting slide 3. Yeah. So one day, after service, at First UU of Detroit, I mentioned that I was planning a southern trip to explore my roots, Primitive Baptist roots, and a friend told me he'd been reading a book by Howard Dorgan. Right here, and I think you have the cover, yes. And I have it if anybody wants to lace through it. I guess last week knew about this book. It was kind of cool to talk to him about it. Sinners in the Hands of an angry God is probably familiar to many of you who have studied Jonathan Edwards and American literary and religious history. And that's what the title reminded me of. It's not angry God, but a happy God. Okay. My immediate association, of course, was with Edwards' sermon delivered during the Great Awakening, in which he excoriates man for his evil ways, condemnation of hell due to innate wickedness. Here's a passage based on a verse from Deuteronomy 32:35. Their foot shall slide in due time. We're all going to go, guys. Okay. So Edwards wrote that, and these are words from him, I believe, should be up there. There's no want of power in God to cast wicked men into hell. And they didn't do men and women, of course that's what they meant, at any moment. Men's hands cannot be strong when God rises up. The strongest have no power to resist him, nor can any deliver out of his hands. He is only able to cast wicked men into hell, but he can easily do that. Sometimes an earthly prince meets, here's one to think about. An earthly prince meets with a great deal of difficulty to subdue a rebel who has found means to fortify himself and has made himself strong by the numbers of his followers. But this is not so with God. There is no fortress that is any defense from the power of God. That's kind of bleak for me. Ooh. So as an English major in college and grad school, I had read this, as I said, and I also read it, though, with discomfort and some disdain, thinking that he was a stuffy, old, self-righteous man. That's the way I felt about him. The next Sunday, my UU friend brought the book to me, and the no-hellers ended up being Primitive Baptist Universalists. Go figure. So I went, what? Anyway, how would it be that the very church of my ancestors, the faith I had associated with self-righteousness, guilt, and sin, and hell, came close to universalism, a part of my own spiritual faith? Dorgan interviewed Primitive Baptist Universalist minister Reese Maggard. Primitive Universalists believe that hell does exist, but as a temporal world condition rather than an afterlife. Hell for the Primitive Baptist Universalists is an absence of God's blessing, a punishment applied in the temporal world for all humans to sin, who sin and turn their backs on the deity. There we go. So further reading of Dorgan revealed a key Universalist antecedent in the Primitive Baptist faith. That would be Hosea Ballou, and you should see his picture there. Looks very stern, but actually looked exactly like our music master at Detroit. His last name was Ballou. I said, you gotta be. Anyway, and we don't know, he might actually be. But he said that the Baptist turned Universalist found images of a wrathful God mean-spirited, vindictive, and worst of all, arbitrary. May be able to allow interminable suffering to be visited upon those he created and prepared to justify, such as an eternity of horror on the grounds of his absolute loathing for those works of his own hands. Ever thought about it that way? So Ballou wrote that a mistaken idea has been entertained of sin, that it is the greatest folly in the world for people to forego salvation in a future state for the comforts and pleasures of sin in this state, this world. Sin was never able to furnish one drop of cordial for the soul. Sin is a false mirror by which the sinner is deceived in everything on which his mind contemplates. In a word, sin is a torment giving nature to every faculty of the soul and is the moral death of the mind. That is an important phrase to me, the moral death of the mind. Don't think, just follow, right? Okay. Dorgan states that Universalism held closer to the traditional Christian base. Unitarianism, on the other hand, placed emphasis on the enlightened humanity's ability to reason into social and spiritual goodness. And to me, that balance has been what's incredibly important about our faith path, is walking those two paths, the compassion, the love, the acceptance, and the reason. Sometimes we have to go back and forth between one and the other. But by this time, as you can imagine, I was about apoplectic about the possibilities that my UU faith had at some point touched my ancestors' faith. But it was not to be. So what we do is I think as humans we desire to connect. But it's not terribly dismal because you'll see it kind of unfolded. It seems that the PBU, I'm going to call them that for shortness, the phenomenon occurred largely in North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and southwestern Virginia. Wouldn't have been Madison County or anywhere in North Alabama. In fact, Sherman Isbell said that it would be unusual to have them in Alabama. But I've still kept going because I was going too far, right? Though my reading of Dorgan and email exchanges with Isabel, I was able to find many promising similarities between UU and the regular primitive Baptist faith, a faith free of fear of an afterlife and hell. Although not the sole cause for the emergence of the primitive Baptist faith, a split between missionary and anti-missionary, some of you probably know about this, between those two things in the 1840s provided a theological divide, and an early voice in the Universalist movement claimed that the word primitive is not barbarism, but adherence to Paulinian theology. In other words, we just read from the Bible, that's what we do. Salvation is God's doing and not man's. According to Dorgan, Potter's deterministic theology is a pure gospel that was pronounced by Christ and the disciples, especially Paul, so his side is the primitives. I never knew that. I thought of it as some kind of weird, reductive process where I was going to get voodoo or something. I'm sorry, I had this really bad view of it. So discovering the aspect opened a door possibility for me to see the faith of my ancestors in a kinder light and to feel connected to my grandmother. Maybe grace by association, stretch it a little bit. His emails did the same, and another aspect which spoke to me was the concept of Sacred Heart music, and I know there are folks in here who know. They could stand up here and tell us about it right now. You probably know what Sacred Heart music is. I was fascinated, and Sherman sent me a link to a family called Wooten who had done a lot of work. But I guess people who can't read music, this goes back to the colonies, people who could not read music would sing a cappella and move their hands with the music, and then they had symbols, fa, sol, la, mi, etc. And people could find those notes because they couldn't read music. Go figure. You know, maybe we should do that. No. At this point of receiving the Sacred Heart link, his emails became really relevant to my personal journey. And by all reports, my grandmother, Nanny B. Russell Chandler, was a fine musician, both playing piano at home, no instruments, of course, in the PB church, and singing at church. A family friend whose mother was my grandmother's best friend, described her in a passed-down story. She was an elegant lady, her hair pulled up and pinned. She sat straight in the pew of a Baptist church. Her lovely voice rose above others. And again, that picture that you see of her with the twist, the elegance of a Victorian woman is there, I think. I said earlier that my mother didn't have anything else but that photo, but that was really wrong because she had a few details about her that she had collected, but of course I wasn't listening. You know? I mean, again, I wish we could have young people's and teenagers' brains record everything that they don't know. Did your kids leave? Oh, they're there. And have it for them to retrieve later because there's so much richness. I wish I could ask my mother now, but there we go. So in my then memoir in progress, which is Searching for Nanny B, 3 Generations of Southern Women, it's the one you saw the cover for before, I wrote the following about my first visit to UU Detroit. This was a moment of real revelation for me, literally on the spot. This would have been Christmas Eve, 2011, when we visited that church for the first time. We stood and sang Christmas carols. I could feel the vibration of the huge pipe organ. I sang as I had not sung for a long time, open and unafraid. I saw Nanny B. Russell Chandler, her full-throated voice, rising to sing Baptist hymns. I saw my mother, Nanny B. Chandler Nelson, in front of me on the Methodist Church choir in Hartselle, singing the Hallelujah chorus in full soprano while I harmonized in alto. I want to sing again. I must sing for my grandmother and for my mother. I must give Nanny B. Russell a voice. Her voice was silenced much too soon. In a way, then, this primitive Baptist religion brought me to this realization in myself. Within our email exchanges, Sherman referred me to archival records at Samford University. My mother attended Howard, which was the college, the private college that was the Baptist college before it became Samford, and to the genealogical archives of Madison County in Huntsville. He addressed the question that had risen in my mind when I thought back on the story of my mother and aunt attending a revival. And he said, if primitive Baptists believe people are predestined to be saved, why would they attend or support a revival which is intended to bring souls to the Lord? My question. I would have thought about this contradiction. It would not have existed with the split in the two churches, but Sherman's answer explained it. There's a variation among various groups. They held to eternal predestination. They also held to faith and repentance and holy living on the part of a human being, and thus to a response made to God, with God creating in the person a willingness to salvation, to respond. They held to intense religious experience of conviction of sin and joy of salvation. The revival, which occurred in Britain and America in the 18th and early 19th century, was distinctly predestinarian in theology. Those were prayed for as being an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. So I thought, maybe the two children who were my mother and aunt were simply calling for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit and not the fear of damnation. That made me feel just a little bit better. As June approached, my excitement and anxiety increased, and the excitement was understandable, but why was I anxious? I realized this trip was mine and mine alone. Many times I've driven the roads from Michigan to Alabama, 75 to 71 to Louisville, and then 65 to North Alabama. I'd drive alone, but it had been a while since I did that. So more than the aspect of being alone, making my decision and schedule for almost 2 weeks was the nagging question. Will I find anything worthwhile, despite what I'd learned about PB? Will they try to save me, ask for my soul, my church, my personal life? I sure hope not. Those stresses were relieved by my arrival at the Isabel family reunion. I'll just give you some little anecdotes. I'm going in thinking, again, all these things I'm bringing with me. I brought a red velvet cake. I thought that would sweeten things up, but I have not been more comfortable than with those folks who didn't look at me with any suspicion. Everybody asked me my name, gave me a name tag. My shawl was tangled on my back, and one woman, Betty, untangled it for me. There was a woman in her 90s who chatted for a few minutes and offered me a peppermint from her purse, and I recalled that my mother used to carry. She used to stuff away peppermints and Werther's butterscotch candies in her purse and under her pillow, so kind of a good feeling. Another family member was a retired history teacher. And if you're a teacher, you know the importance of critical thinking. I'm thinking, did they think critically in this church in the South? Blah 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 blah. All the things, those germs those particular parts of the germs I'm trying to get rid of. But we talked a long time about the importance of critical thinking in the classroom, and then given the current climate at the time, I told him he was a hero for forcing his students to think. So much for the stereotypes. Before we ate, Sherman Isbell, who had organized the reunion, said a few words about the graveyard tours and then led a prayer, and we consumed lunch in short order. We got that one up. You're going to love this. You have it. Sherman with King Kong? You have it? Well, he told me later his family thought he was being attacked or mauled by King Kong. But anyway, that's the thing. I hope I'm making my point, is that I came into this thinking it was going to be stiff and punitive, and everything was fun and people were loving, and it was such an incredible experience. So I went to see the grave after that. Met with Priscilla at her library job so I could follow her, and we drove to Mr. Butler's house. Butler was related to my grandmother's best friend, all of this connection. and the cousin, the cousin of Lucy, yeah. And I'd spoken with him on the phone. He told me that the church had burned and they had rebuilt it, and that he had retrieved a couple of pews. And so I thought, well, I'll see that. Maybe I'll have I wanted his blessing on visiting the cemetery. So we went, and here again is a passage from the memoir called Visiting the Grave. Soon we turn off of Cherry Tree Road on Poplar Ridge, on an even smaller road than the others I've taken to get here. Just after the turn, the cemetery lies on the left. It's a green sign, Bethel Cemetery. Across the road is a green field of corn. There are no cars or trucks. We leave our cars. And remember, I came from Detroit. And the Detroit area is busy. A lot of stuff going on. But I'm loving this. We left our cars, and Priscilla unlatches the metal fence. And I wonder briefly why the cemetery is not more protected. How easy it is to walk through the rusting gate and onto the grounds. Are the graves protected against what? People ransacking the stones and breaking monuments? No, it's just very peaceful. It was so quiet. The only sounds are distant cars or trucks, cicadas in the trees nearby. I walk past family plots with large stones, Moon, Butler, Cooper, McPeters. I follow Priscilla to the left down the little hill, walking to a small sunken area which borders the side of the cemetery, and I see the gravestone, so much smaller than it seemed in the photo. I'm struck by its simplicity, the lack of information. There is no message, no beloved wife, no beloved mother, no dates. The first name is spelled incorrectly. A lamb made of concrete lies at the top, its head missing. I feel anger and sorrow that she's been neglected so long. Okay, I think we're ready. What do we have up now? Yeah, there we go. Okay. I stand near the stone in a brown sundress. Priscilla takes my picture 3 times. For the first 2, I don't smile. But for the 3rd, I do. It's always better to smile for these pictures, she says, breaking the silence. As Priscilla and John walk about the cemetery, I brush my hand over the lamb's neck, sharp, jagged concrete where the head broke off. I look around, imagining that I can spot the rest of the lamb, but I see nothing nearby, or even the edge of the woods that borders the graveyard. I imagine my 10-year-old mother standing in the little sunken area in front of her mother's grave, her hands folded, her eyes are on the stone, and then she looks down to the ground and again at the stone as if imagining somehow that she can reach out to her mother. I take pictures of the other Russells, son Russell, I think an infant, they usually just put infant or son on a child that has died in infancy. Mary Russell, John R., Delilah Jane, these are my 2 grandparents. Calvin Russell, Calvin's and John's graves have flat military stones from the Confederacy, and each has a flag. Delilah Jane died at 68, that would be my great-grandmother, the same year as her daughter, Nanny B. And Calvin died at 19, no doubt killed after fighting for the Tennessee Cavalry. John R., my great-grandfather, lived to 84, marrying again after Delilah Jane, and taking the leading role in the Poplar Ridge community and Bethel Church. So you'll see that I got his handwriting and some records. After the visit, we drove a short distance down the road to the church, where John had arranged for a member of the church to meet me. And when we arrived, I noted the simple lines of this small square church. John had told me that the fire had been rebuilt after a fire a few decades before, and that all of the original furniture had been disposed of, except the 2 original pews, one of which he refinished. I had a slim hope that I might be able to bring home a half of a pew, perhaps one in which my grandmother had sat. I might even be able to connect with her DNA, but of course. My sister was laughing at me about that. I had a small escape and coming home with the half of a pew in the back of it. But he did not offer, and I didn't ask because I didn't want to push my luck in his hospitality. We entered the church from the side into the church cafeteria, and I took photos of the interior and some documents on the wall. I saw the Civil War from the side of the Confederates. I hadn't really thought about this much at this point, that they had taken a huge risk in separating from the nation, less than 100 years since the Revolution. Since the Revolution and the formation. Their colonial ancestors were barely 2 generations behind them. Why couldn't they choose to live under their own governing? Okay. Guided by my father's progressive views, I had always seen the South's secession as foolish and wrong-headed. The idea of holding on to slavery was inhumane, to say the least. Yet the loss of life in that war was horrible. 10% deaths for Union males 20 to 25, 30% for Southern males, age 18 to 40. I knew anecdotally that family members had fought against family members, and now I had a view from the other side. This little church had felt its existence threatened by the Yankee occupation. The sanctity of the church was very simple. Sanctuary, decorated with wooden pews and soft purple cushions. As I spoke with the church member Priscilla and John Ed, I remembered that I'd been told by a deacon who could help me with research. This church is the same as the one it replaced. We never changed our service in 100 years. So I made plans to attend at 5:30. Yeah, this is the next day. When I'm there, I will worship as my grandmother worshiped. I had no idea what to expect. On Sunday, during a heavy rain, I made a second visit to the graveyard. The rain had slackened to a drizzle, and I arrived earlier than I expected, around 4:30, so I put a rain jacket over my dress and athletic shoes and grabbed the scrub brush I had purchased to clean off dirt and residue from the stones. My grandmother's stone was free of moss, as were the stones of John R. Russell, and his red, they're not up there yet. You can go ahead and put them up. I think. Private, I hate these little codes, 2D, Company, Confederate Infantry, Georgia Falls, Confederate States Army, 1839, January 23rd, 23, and his brother, Calvin, whose stone read November 26th to 1844 to March 24th, 1863, a very young man. I stopped to calculate his age, and it was 18 years. So, how do I mourn for this war? I asked myself, for those lost. What is my legacy? I've come across lists of slaves in some of my father's line. I cannot change history. I can only lament it. The stone of my great-grandmother, Delilah, was covered with green moss, so I knelt down and scrubbed on the spots 3, 4, 5 times, and finally the stone was clean. If you've ever done this, you know that stuff is ground in really deep for years and years. I spoke to her. I wonder if anyone's done this duty for you. I was filled with a sense of warmth, peace, and connection. I thought of the ancestral research I had contemplated or completed on Delilah's family name, the Chapmans. I traced it back to the Tudor courts of Henry VII and VIII, and even to a nanny who watched over Elizabeth I. An earlier version of the name was the Norman French Champernot, perhaps related to the leaders of the Norman invasion. There we got we could all probably find that somewhere in our genes. But aristocracy in a rural church yard in North Alabama. Aristocratic blood ran in the veins of a woman who was all but forgotten after birthing her daughter, after her death at 26. When I finished with Delilah Stone, I drove to Bethel Church for the service, and I was greeted by a man who ended up being a deacon, George Denmark, and he and Elder Ricky Sinyard would lead the service. But first there was singing a cappella. We were led by Deacon Blackwood, with whom I spoke on the phone before leaving Michigan. When I'd called him, Mrs. Blackwood said, he's out bush hogging. Bush hogging, I said, what a beautiful word, I need to write that one down. She must have thought it strange that I didn't know that bush hogging is clearing land with a special kind of tractor. And by the way, the people in New Hope, Alabama were just in stitches when I read this part. They said, I'm from Michigan and I know what bush hogging is, but anyway, I learned something. I wonder if my farmer ancestors bush hogged with horse and wagon, and I try to imagine it. Dorgan outlines the basic elements of the Primitive Baptist services: handshaking, singing, and preaching. He writes that both in traditional and Primitive Baptist churches, they de-emphasize the precise starting times, treating beginning with casualness that seems to eradicate the entire notion of tardiness. There's absolutely no assumption that everyone will engage in the worship process or any part of it at exactly the same time. Thus, no code prohibits the individual who arrives late from making her or his handshaking rounds of the congregation, even if preaching's already begun, or from walking directly into the stand to embrace an elder he hasn't seen in a year before finding a place in the regular worship area. On Sunday night, as I stood talking with elders and deacons, men and women, about 15 total, began filling into the sanctuary. As each one entered, she or he went to every person to shake hands, and in my case, to say her or his name, and I participated with pleasure. It seemed a wonderful way to break the ice as a stranger and a visitor in the community. One exception to the handshaking was a woman in light green, and these anecdotes are intended, I think, to help see how I was feeling also at the time. She had a kind of limp and was holding her body slightly bent. She was a young woman, and I thought probably in her 50s, and I reached out my hand, and she embraced me, putting her arms around my neck. "So I guess we're not shaking hands," I said. "I know you. I talked to you on the phone. I'm Ricky Senyard's wife." I felt somehow blessed, singled out by her embrace. Of course, thank you so much for your help regarding the church records. I told her my name and why I was there. "My name is Siriana." What a lovely name. The service began, and I sat behind her. "May I record the service?" "Yes," she whispered. Others used to make recordings. I thanked her and turned on my phone recorder. Throughout the service, I noticed her turn slightly toward me as if to make sure I was okay. Just, are you comfortable in our church? Dorgan tells of the tradition of singing in both traditional and Primitive Baptist churches. Both, he says, quote, start the singing part without announcement. A seated elder, perhaps unseen in some congregations, simply begins the first hymn on singing the initial verse. Not so with the service I attended. Deacon Blackwood led the singing, joined by Ricky Senyard's son. The Dorgan's description, however, of the slow and stretched out nature of lined old-time Baptist singing did fit. And everybody, it was but that was okay because I loved it. I loved being there. Dorgan writes of the differences in the preaching aspects of the regular churches. Regular Baptist churches may have as many as 8 people preaching in a given service. Yikes. Primitive Baptist ones are self-effacing, assiduously avoiding any semblance of ego, ambition, or pride. If any pulpit success is achieved, it is solely to God's credit. I saw this in both sermons, Ricky Senyard and George Denmark, and I will just summarize George's very briefly to get you an idea. But both of them talked straight from the Bible, the primitive notion of Pauline theology. George Denmark combined self-effacement with humor. He spoke of sin and temptation in his life, and I paraphrase, I can walk right by the lottery counter and the beer cooler, no problem. But you put chocolate cake in front of me, and I am in trouble. And then he went on to say that he might be tempted to eat 2 pieces, and that would be even worse, both physically and spiritually for him. So at the end of the service, the time was given to offer prayers of support to people in trouble, kind of like our joys and sorrows. Several spoke of ill members and neighbors, and when the room became silent, I said, I'd like to offer a prayer for my grandmother. Nanny B. Russell Chandler, 1879 to 1905. She was here. She was unknown. I want to find her. My prayer was accepted as if I were a member of the congregation. At the end of the service, a heavy rain began and dashed sheets of water against the side of the church. So we waited for a few minutes inside. I talked to Siriana, asking if she would write down her address so I could thank her and her husband. You want me to write it? I think you'd better. A few minutes later, she told me she'd been in a major car wreck. Please be careful in going home. Watch out for other cars. Again, I felt blessed. She said, I have MS, and was on a lot of drugs, and I went to sleep at the wheel. Now I understand her gait, the odd configuration of her body. As I began to back out my car out of the spot, she was walking behind me. Now, don't you run me over. That wouldn't be good. She waved, and I waved goodbye. I returned to the church the next Sunday as I was leaving Alabama to return home to Michigan. I had made an appointment with Mr. Blackwood to look in a box stored high in the cabinet, which he thought contained records, and they did. So when I arrived at my 9 o'clock appointment, he was waiting. All these manuscripts were laid out in chronological order, most of them signed by John R. Russell, who was the secretary at the time. You can imagine, well, if you have this passion, you can imagine how that felt. So they were frayed and yellowed, and I was really afraid to touch them. Some of the records in the middle of 19th century were missing, but as he summarized, Ricky Sinyard summarized in the history, excuse me, Mr. Blackwell allowed me to look through the 19th century records, during which time my great-grandfather was church clerk, and I touched the pages where he had signed, and I took photos. I looked for references to my grandmother and found only his next wife, Minzie. In the history of the Primitive Baptist Church, Sinyard outlines the church's beliefs, and I paraphrase as follows. Belief in the Bible as absolute rule of faith and practice. All are sinners, but good works are the fruit of faith and are evidence of our gracious state. Christ is the great head of the church. Baptism and communion will be continued until the second coming. True believers are the only fit subjects for baptism, and dipping is the only gospel mode. Washing of feet will remain a practice of the church. Only the baptized can participate in communion, and the Sabbath will be observed and set apart with the only work of necessity allowed. And finally, God has, quote, elected a people to eternal salvation and made all the arrangements necessary for them to live with him in glory. The man who wins salvation already has it. You can see what that can mean at that point in my journey. So we examined the records until about 11 o'clock, and then he said he had to go, and I was ready to get on the road, anxious for my 700-mile drive, during which I could contemplate all I had learned and experienced. I had one more stop, Bethel Cemetery. I wanted to say goodbye to my grandmother. Mr. Blackwell drove away on his pickup, and I headed to the cemetery, but I realized I needed flowers for her grave. So I turned my car around and went back toward the church, the direction I thought to be New Hope, and I saw him pulling onto the road, so I flagged him down. I need to find artificial flowers for my grandmother's grave. Can you direct me? Mr. Blackwell thought a minute. I can lead you toward Huntsville. Will Walmart do? It's even 7 miles away. Of course it will, I said. I smiled at the irony. I had boycotted Walmart for over a decade because of their bad labor practice, but now I was happy to go to one, anything for my grandmother. He led me to the store, got out of the car, and said, "So you all right?" "Fine," I responded. We hugged and waved goodbye. My brief experience with the Primitive Baptist Church negated all the stereotypes that I had carried with me my whole life, that they were judgmental, that they wanted to save me, that unless I was one of them, I would be made to feel unwelcomed, that they were dour people, old and frumpy, with no sense of humor. All these stereotypes failed to be true, and yes, I had seen letters of dismission in the church minutes, and yes, these people do not indulge, or should not, in the sins of the flesh, which I enjoy so much myself. But they were to me people of warmth, joy, and love. One of the repeated statements in the minutes written by my great-grandfather is, quote, "Call for the worship of the church," and there's an unreadable word, "in peace." I'd zoomed my photos. I even called Sarithia to find out what that word was, and she didn't know either. So we decided that the spirit of the statement was, may the fellowship of the church be in peace. And that works for me. After picking out 2 bunches of purple and blue flowers, I made a swift return to the cemetery. I stood for a few minutes in front of the grave, listening again to the engines, the breeze, the cicadas, and I thought again of my mother standing in this spot, a 10-year-old girl left without a mother and not knowing why. This is from my memoir. I drive away from the cemetery. I think of the broken lamb on the tombstone. I know that in Victorian era, lambs are often placed on the gravestones of children as a sign of innocence, of a person gone too soon. Gone too soon, innocent. My grandmother, Nanny B. Russell, was both of these things. She was less than 1 year with her new husband, her love. She was a beautiful young woman of 26. She left a daughter with a gift of music. Her blood runs in my veins. Perhaps the lamb represents this little girl Nanny B. birthed just an hour after she died, or before she died. Perhaps the lamb is also for me, not dying young, not innocent, but trying to put the pieces back together to find the missing head to complete the story. My journey is not finished. So now, I'm surprised, don't you? Are you ready?
Okay, you see on your order of service down there, there's something below Nancy's name. We're gonna give this a shot. Now, was this song sung at the service you went to?
Yes. And I have the recording of it if you're able to hear that slow and drawn out thing.
You want it to coach
You
you,
want me to
though. You
draw?
want your mic on or not?
No, if I'm supposed to be with you.
Let's cut that on. Take your pocket.
Hang on.
Okay. You want over here. He's got to be there. All right, here we go. Oh, Lord. We're not warmed up. Play it once through.
Join us in the chorus first.
Go ahead, son.
No, you play it through.
We'll sing, give me a tune.
Oh, sometimes the shadows are deep, and love sings the laughter below, and sorrow sometimes how they sweep, like tempest down over the soul. Oh, then to the rock let me fly, to to me a month ago, I'd never heard this song, but once you sing it, you will never get it out of your head.
Get in your brain.
We can turn it back up. Let's turn this one back up. You might need that one on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll be very precise. What about this hymn? According to the Christianity magazine, June 1992, the rock that is higher than I comes from Psalms 61:2. For the end of the earth will I call unto thee. From the end of the earth will I call unto thee when my heart is overwhelmed. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. The article goes on to discuss the identity of the rock, Jesus the Savior, as higher as being a deity, having greater knowledge and power than humans, being equal to the Father, and finally being an object of man's faith and worthy of worship. Why did I choose this hymn for our attention, other than I couldn't get it out of my head? I think it's because as a Unitarian Universalist, I can identify with the song's metaphors for life, a weary soul, deep sorrows and shadows, like tempests, climbing a steep path. I think we all face these troubling times and forces in our lives. Our tradition tells us to use reason, but I know reason does not always solve life's challenges. Perhaps the rock for me might be my husband, my deceased husband, or a close friend, or a counselor, or perhaps my older sister who passed in 2018, but she did have the pleasure of seeing this book published. Somehow, for my purpose today, my search to understand my grandmother has been a kind of rock to which I fly when I'm feeling frayed, exhausted, and anxious. Let's face it, our ancestors aren't going anywhere. We can always find them. Amen.